Hello and welcome to another video. Now, a couple weeks ago, or perhaps a month or two ago, depending upon when this comes out, I will have done my first attempt at Injera bread. This is that fluffy, spongy Ethiopian bread that's served as a side dish at Ethiopian restaurants. Now, today we're actually going to make Injera again, this time much better than before. I still don't think it's perfect, but we'll talk a lot about the learnings that have gone into getting this far. Now, Injera serves as a bunch of different roles. In Ethiopian cuisine, it is a plate, it is eating utensils, it is of course, a source of carbohydrates, and it is just a wonderful addition to pretty much all Ethiopian cuisine. So, with that in mind, let's discuss ingredients. Now, what I have here is I have teff flour. Teff is the traditional grain in Ethiopia, but most Ethiopian restaurants in the West use mostly wheat flour and then add just a little teff. So we're still going to use 50% teff flour because I like the way it tastes. But this is just, a note for authenticity purposes. The second thing that we will use here is a whole grain flour, and I have a spelt flour, so I'm using that, but like a whole wheat flour would be usable also. And then finally, we have water. In terms of volume, it's 1 part teff flour, 1 part whole wheat flour or whole spelt flour, and 3 parts water. So this is what we're going to start today, and then probably tomorrow or Sunday, depending upon how quickly it ferments, we will go on to the next step. And in that process, we will use a bunch of other hacks that have been passed to me by folks with very strong connections to Ethiopia and Africa. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we'll do is we'll start with the teff flour, and I'm going to add 1/4 of a liter here roughly. And then we'll take the whole grain flour. We'll add 1/4 of a liter of that. Now, one of the things that you can learn from my first attempt video is how important it is to pay very close attention to the actual fermentation process. This isn't something that you can follow with a recipe in terms of time. This is something you have to actually use your senses on. And then 3/4 of a liter of water. And then we will stir this up. You could use a whisk here, that would be fine, but a spoon works just fine. And it will form a kind of a slurry. You don't have to worry if there's some lumps in it at this stage. The lumps will slowly dissolve. But you should at least try to get it, mostly dissolved here. Now what we're going to do is we are going to cover this with a lid, and we will set this aside for as long as it takes until it ferments well. So I'm expecting 1 or 2 days, and then we'll be back. Hello and welcome back. Now, it's been almost 2 days. We could probably let this go a little longer, but I'm not 100% sure. As you remember from my previous video, the first time I let it go for 4 days and it was way too long in this particular microculture. Now, how long you let it go for depends very much on the local wild yeast, both its prevalence and how aggressive it is when it actually gets in and starts fermenting. If you let things go too long, you'll get a product which is extremely sour and very gluey. If you don't let it go far enough, it's just simply going to not really have the right flavor or texture. So, we'll talk a little bit more about how to determine when it's done. You're going to have to play around with this a little bit to figure it out, especially since we're cooking with wild cultures. This is a significant problem. So, in addition to the material from last time, I have some sparkling water and some tap water. And we're going to use both of these as we go forward. So, let's go ahead and resume what we're doing. I'll show you what this looks like and how to determine that it's ready. Thank you. So the first thing to notice is the stuff on the top. Now this is yeast, and it's the foam from the yeast. And what we can see is that the yeast here is really growing nicely and aggressively. And if we shift this, well, I can't really shift it around very much because the yeast is really bubbling very well. And in fact, I might not even be able to drain much off the top. If you let this go too long again, the yeast will exhaust itself and lactobacillus will set in. And that's the stage we don't really want to be at. So I'm going to drain any of the top off that I can, but I'm not going to try too hard. And then from there, I'm going to thicken it up like last time. So I've measured out half a cup or an eighth of a liter of this batter. And I have a cup of water here ready to boil. You could let this sit a little longer, but I think it's going to have better bubbles if we go now. So we will, I didn't manage to get much off the top of this. If there's any liquid floating off the top, you get rid of that. But in this case, the yeast is really going to town, so we're going to go ahead and leave it as it is. So we'll be back when the water boils. So the water boiled. I added the batter in, and I'm stirring it with a whisk to thicken it. Now this is thickening a little differently than normal because it's a little bit thinner as far as the batter goes, but this is still pretty good. And we can see here now we have this sort of gluey consistency, which is what we want for this part. And we're going to take this off the heat. So once this has come off the heat, we're going to whisk these together. Let me go get my, I'm going to use a rubber spatula to remove all of the rest of this. And we will whisk these together. We should get a batter that is just barely warm to the touch. It shouldn't be hot enough to kill the yeast. And this is a little bit thinner than I would typically like, but maybe I think it should still work. So now I'm heating up my pan. I have rubbed a little oil in it. We need to get the pan really hot, but it's hard to heat up a non-stick pan safely without something in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until it's pretty hot, but not, hot enough. And I'm going to pour just a little bit of batter in. I'm going to cook kind of a, sort of a sad, kind of almost Injera, just to keep the pan temperature under control while this warms up. So now this is pretty hot, but not hot enough. So I'm just going to pour in, think of it like a small pancake. And we're just going to let this cook here as a way of providing a thermal ballast on the pan while it warms up. Now, if you have like a nice cast iron or something else, then you could use that instead. In fact, maybe I should have done that this time. But with a non-stick pan, because I figure that's what many of you have, this is a nice safe way to bring everything up to a good safe temperature. Now, as this cooks, I'm going to take about some part of this bottle of carbonated water, and I'm going to pour it into the batter and whisk it up lightly. The reason for that is this will provide some extra bubbles. So, my first attempt is off, or semi-attempt. Remember, it's just there for ballast. I've added a little more oil to the pan. And I've added a little more soda water and spelt to the batter to give it a little bit less of a gluey consistency. Now, one thing that's super important here is to try to have a really even layer. So you see here, it is cooking. It's actually looking really good, and we'll come back when this one is done. Okay, so this is starting to look very, very done. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to roll it up in the pan. One problem here is that my pan here was actually probably slightly too hot, but that'll be fine because as this rests, it'll all become less fried, if you will. And then I'm just going to take this out. I'm going to set it rolled up on a plate like this. And here we have our Injera bread. Now, this still isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it was the first time I made it. Next, we'll go ahead and do a taste test, and that'll be it. I'm going to make the rest of this to go with my dinner, which will be an Ethiopian chicken stew. Darawat. So, on for the taste test. Now, as I mentioned, if you let this sit for a little bit, so I just flipped it over so that it's not quite as crispy. It's not supposed to be crispy. We're going to go ahead and just taste a little bit. So, I don't think I would have wanted to let this ferment any longer. It's already starting to develop the distinct sourdough flavor, and that's fine. It's very good. But if you let it go too long, then you're going to end up with a very sour, very gluey bread, and that's not so great. So this is really good. It has that nutty teff flavor that you kind of hope to have. And the consistency, while still just a little bit on the gluey side, is very nice from the perspective of something you might be sopping up a stew broth with, or eating kitfa or something like this. This is really, really nice. So hope you enjoy making this as much as I do. And I want to say that if you enjoy this content, you find it useful, I hope I earned a subscription from you. Also, I look at likes, I look at views, and I look at comments in terms of deciding what to make more of. So you can actively participate in the process of helping me select my next project by doing that, also leaving suggestions in the comments. I look at those very carefully too. So, at any rate, I want to say bon appetit and see you next week.